We had done a lot of Franklin last week. Remember, like any rationalist, he has a method for everything. He had a method for moral perfection. He uses the scientific method all the time, where he decides what a problem is, decides what the solution is, tries experiments with it, and then revises it. He did the same thing with the street lights in London. We didn't do the street lights, did we? The problem is that the street lights get dim. They're big globes, and the smoke coats the inside of them after they've been lit for a little while. You can't really see with them. Franklin had built the Franklin stove, which would be one way that Franklin might look like a romantic. He builds the Franklin stove. Another guy starts building the stove without Franklin's permission. And instead of suing him, Franklin says he believes that inventions belong to the people, to the good of society. So he had a chance to make money, and he didn't. That makes him look romantic. But if you look at it a little bit further, he was about to retire then anyway. Did Franklin want to go into the stove making business? No, he was done with the printing business pretty much. All that he could have gained there was the right to have somebody else not make the stove. He didn't want to make them himself, and they probably wouldn't have gotten made if somebody else wasn't making them. Although he didn't get any money out of it, they're still known as the Franklin stove. He would have had to spend a year or more with lawyers, spending a lot of money to get the right to do something he didn't want to do anyway. So the reasonable thing was to just let it go. But you notice Franklin still managed to get at least political capital out of it by announcing publicly that he's letting it go. So although he doesn't make any money, nevertheless it still gets known as the Franklin stove, and Franklin gets known as the benefactor. In any case, he had used a principle there, which he had gotten from his study of science, that hot air rises, and so he'd opened up a flue in the bottom of the stove and the chimney at the top, and drew the hot air, drew the cool air in with it, went up the flue. So he applies the same thing, again, using the scientific method. You take knowledge you have, and you try to solve a different problem with it, and he decides that the problem is that the smoke can't get out. That's why it coats the inside of the globe. So initially he puts a little chimney on the top and an opening at the bottom so the air can go all the way up through. And that solves the problem of the inside of the globe getting smoky. But there's an additional problem. And he tries to solve that simultaneously. And the problem is that if you crack the globe anywhere on the globe, you have to replace the whole thing. What's Franklin's solution? Four panes of glass. Globes have to be blown glass, so they're much more expensive. Flat glass is easier to make. It's cheaper. You put four sides in of glass. If you break one of them, you only have to replace one. You don't have to replace the whole thing. He proposes that to the British, but the British say, but it's traditional to have dim, smoky lights that you can't see by. And so they kept their globes. Philadelphia became the first place in America to have street lights. Surprisingly, since that's where Franklin lived, what do you think they looked like? Globes with no openings? No, they looked like Franklin's little house with four glass sides and a chimney on it. So again, he uses the scientific method. He solves one problem and then he uses the information for that to go on and solve another. You can see a good example of his plain style in the Savages in North America. Now, some critics have argued that Franklin never took anything seriously, except science, and there may be some question about science. I mean, you've all heard of Franklin flying the kite in the storm, and lightning strikes the kite and the key lights up. Think about that for a while. How much electricity would it take running down that string to make a solid key glow? A huge amount. Enough to fry whoever was holding the string. Franklin must never have conducted that experiment in reality. I think Franklin did it as a joke. He wrote up the experiment. It did prove what he said about electricity was true, But I mean, think how much electricity it takes to make that little teeny filament hot enough to give off light. Probably the whole entire hill would have been devastated if the lightning had run down that string. So nobody had to be and there was no record of anybody being struck by lightning holding a kite, so apparently Franklin didn't hire anybody else. If he did it himself, he would have been fried, so probably the experiment didn't get carried out. And I think he thought that the scientists would all realize that, and they would see that it was a joke, but they didn't. He gets inducted into the Royal Society, and now he's got a problem. If he says it was a joke, nobody will ever take an American. I mean, he was the first American to get inducted into a Royal Society. This was, remember, Americans were we were intellectual outcasts. They didn't think we had anybody here with a brain. And finally, one of us is getting recognition. He's getting inducted into the British Royal Society. If he tells them it's a joke, they'll never take us seriously again. On the other hand, if he goes in, he's going in kind of under false pretenses. So he decides it's better off for America if I just keep my mouth shut. And of course, what he had said about electricity was all true. But I think it was his little joke about the experiment, and ever since everybody's treated as if it must really have happened, but I don't see how it really could have. The Savage in North America ends with a joke. First of all, you notice that it goes step by step. It gives lots of examples. Who are the real savages in North America? Native Americans, the Indians, or the white Europeans? White Europeans. Every time he compares their culture, he has to come to the conclusion that the Indians have a better culture. He says if you go to an Indian village, they give you a place to stay, they feed you, they let you rest, and only then do they ask you where you're going and can they help you in any way. What happens if you come to one of our settlements without money? They give you a room, feed you anyway, ask if they can help you? No, civilized people drive you out if you don't have any money. He says the uncivilized Indians, when they have a meeting, one person talks at a time, everybody else listens respectfully. Even no matter how preposterous the ideas are that are proposed, they treat them with respect. They say, well, you'll have to go home and think about that for a while. And then they may come back the next day and reject it, like they do with the minister's stories. But at least they listen respectfully to one another. What's the legislature in American England like? One person talking? Franklin says not. He says somebody gets up, people shout him down, there are catcalls, they're jeering him, they're arguing with him. He can scarcely be heard. The chairman wears out gavel after gavel, trying to hammer people into silence. They even occasionally attack one another. Nobody has any respect for anybody's ideas. And they're supposed to be the more civilized. He even makes an argument for the intelligence of women. In fact, he's made two in what we had read from him. One was when he said he was in business with a guy, and the guy never made his payments on time, and he kept terrible books. And then he died, and his wife took over. And what happened then? The wife kept perfect books and always paid him on time. So Franklin says, therefore, I think women should be educated in business so that they can run businesses until their sons grow up. Why not just say women should be educated in business so they can run businesses? What did men think about women's intellect then? That they didn't have any. That would be too much of a change in people's minds. Franklin knew that when people change their minds, they change it by degrees. They don't make enormous changes in their beliefs. And most people would have said, no, women shouldn't be educated. So Franklin gives them an instance that they can say, well, yes, maybe in that circumstance, women should be given an education in business. Of course, if you educate women in business to run businesses in case their husbands die until their sons grow up, some of the sons won't want the business. And so women will continue in business. The ones where their sons will want the business, the women who've run the business will have accumulated a lot of knowledge. and will be more likely to set up businesses of their own. Plus, the more women running businesses until their sons grow up, the more people get used to doing business with women anyway, and the more they come to accept it. In other words, Franklin expects over the long haul to get to the point where a business education for women isn't even something that anybody raises an eyebrow at. But he thinks it's going to take a long time. Remember that the rationalists don't expect perfection. They don't even like revolutionary change. They like things that change slowly, bit by bit. So he gives them something that they can accept, rather than giving something he knows they'll reject out of hand. Again, a rationalist would say it's better to have a few people agree with you than to alienate everybody. Franklin always went out of his way not to alienate people. In this one, in the Savages in North America, he says that the women keep the records. They listen to the treaties, they memorize them, they pass them on to their daughters, and when we come back 100 years later, errors have crept into the written copies we've kept. But their records are still flawless. Well, if you can memorize a treaty and pass it on by word of mouth and keep that for 100 years, 5 generations maybe, and obviously women have some intelligence. He doesn't push that though. Why not? He knows it's going to alienate people. So he just lays the information out and leaves you to draw the conclusion. And he does the same thing with the Savages in North America. He gives us all of this evidence that shows that Native American culture was clearly superior to so-called civilization in a number of different ways. But when he gets to the end, he doesn't draw the conclusion that Native American culture is superior to European culture, to American culture. Why not? Will people accept that idea? No. So instead, he gives them the evidence and then leaves them to draw their own conclusion. And the very last thing he does is tell this little joke. The Indians come in with their furs. The white men say, we'll give you a price, but we have to go to church first. And the Indian says, they say they go to church to learn good things. But they go to church every week. And if that were true, they would have learned some good things by now, but you can't see any evidence of it. Instead, when they come out of church, they're all offering the same low price. So he comes to the conclusion that church is a place where white men go to get together and cheat the Indians. It's true. If you said that without any kind of a joke around it, would people accept that? No, even though they knew it was absolutely true. They all had experience with it. They wouldn't have accepted it, but when he puts it in the form of a joke, they can. Now, why make people laugh at the end of that? You want somebody to make to draw an unpalatable conclusion. What kind of mood do you want them in? Angry or happy? Happy, because they're much more likely to accept an idea they wouldn't accept otherwise. And that's what Franklin does. He gives you all the evidence. He doesn't draw the conclusion, because as soon as he does, everybody will get defensive about their culture being superior. Instead, he gives you the evidence, puts you in a good mood, lets you draw the conclusion for yourself. If Franklin put all of these jokes in because he loved to laugh, would he be a rationalist or a romantic? Laughing is emotion. Who's emotional? The romantics. But if he uses it as a tool, then he's a rationalist. He's using it as a means to an end. Now, Franklin did like to laugh, but he uses humor all the time to make the points that he wants. If you read Poor Richard's Almanac, first of all, he manages to distance himself from everything that's said in it by having a narrator called Father Abraham. And Father Abraham is continually quoting from Poor Richard. And Poor Richard says little, short things like a rolling stone gathers no moss, or when it comes to honesty, it's hard for an empty sack to stand upright, or early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. All things that are short, simple, easy to remember. And if you don't agree with them, Franklin says, well, that's only what Father Abraham said that Poor Richard said. I'm not really responsible for that. If you agreed with it, then Franklin would say, well, they are my literary creations. So again, it's everything he does. He can take the credit if it's there, and he can walk away from the blame if that's there. Most of the time, he puts those things in little anecdotes, little stories that make a joke. Now, when you read Franklin's essays, he's got a series of points that he wants to make. But every one of them will be illustrated by a little anecdote. And he knows people like to laugh. And some people only read them for the jokes. But it doesn't matter, because Franklin has the jokes arranged in such a way that if that's all you read, you're still going to come to the same conclusion that he comes to. You can follow his argument, but if you can't follow his argument, you can at least be entertained, and while you're being entertained, Franklin is convincing you anyway. So Franklin uses humor as a tool. I think that, anybody have any questions or comments on Franklin before we pass on to Edwards? Okay, Jonathan Edwards, I think, uses emotion in the same way. Now, Jonathan Edwards, remember when we looked at Puritanism when it first started out, we had Bradford's group, and that was as balanced as Puritanism got. They had both the emotional and the intellectual. Felt God's presence, but you had to convince people you had felt it. By the second generation, it's tilted one way, towards the intellectual. The children of the Puritans can no longer say that they feel God's presence, and so the Puritans are faced with either keeping their children out of their churches or making a compromise. And they make the halfway covenant. The halfway covenant says as long as you understand the theology, you can join the congregation, and they'll wait for you to get your calling. They'll wait for you to have your experience of God. The longer things go on, the more intellectual things Puritanism gets. It becomes an increasingly small, but very wealthy and very well educated and very sophisticated group. It centers around Harvard and around Boston. And it becomes basically the religion of the wealthy and the powerful. And that goes on for a pretty long time. And then Samuel Stoddard, Jonathan Edwards' grandfather, comes along. And Stoddard says we're supposed to be saving souls. We're supposed to be out finding, and since everybody is potentially a member of the elect, there are all kinds of members of the elect out there, and we haven't been going after them. Franklin says the majority of ordinary people are being ignored entirely by Puritanism, and that's where we ought to focus. Now, can they understand this? Maybe not. Can they feel God's benevolence? Maybe not. But they can do one thing. They can understand how terrifying God is. They can at least be afraid. We can make all of them afraid. And that's what Stoddard does. Stoddard goes out on these tours of the local congregations, and he preaches there, and he terrifies everybody. Now remember, there was no television at the time. People were desperate for entertainment, and they looked on preaching as a form of entertainment. Everybody went to see Samuel Stoddard. Now, normally people think of Jonathan Edwards as the classic fire and brimstone minister, ranting and raving and moving up and down, full of gestures and facial expressions and changes of voice and acting things out. And in fact, he wasn't like that at all. Edwards supposedly stared straight ahead at the bell rope in the back of the church, didn't make eye contact with anybody, had no gestures. He spoke in a monotone voice with no emotion, and yet he terrified people. Just as Stoddard had done. Stoddard was the one who put on the big show, and everybody went to see the show. But they didn't realize how good Stoddard was going to be. Stoddard terrified them. And at the end, when he wanted them all to come up and rededicate themselves to being good Puritans, they all did, because he had made them so certain that they were damned otherwise. Now, people don't stay scared for that long. So every 2 or 3 years, Stoddard would have to go out on what he called his harvests and preach these terrifying sermons and scare everybody back into the fold again. Now, the Puritans around Harvard and Boston hated Stoddard. He was making Puritanism, he was widening out the base of Puritanism. He was bringing in the unlettered and the unwashed as far as they were concerned. Ordinary people who had nothing in common with these wealthy elite members of the elect who were running everything. So they saw him as weakening Puritanism because he was going to create so many divisions inside of it. And they would have loved to have gotten rid of him. But he was so powerful, he was called the Pope of the Connecticut Valley. So they waited for him to die. And so did other people. Stoddard had ministers who were his followers, who had learned from him and had that same vivid style of preaching. But when he dies, he passes his pulpit on to Jonathan Edwards, his grandson. Now, he didn't have a son, he only had a daughter. Her husband was a minister, he had his own congregation. So it passes to Jonathan Edwards. And in some ways, Jonathan Edwards is a good choice. I don't think we read his personal narrative. But in his personal narrative, he talks about how he struggled so hard to be perfect, and how he continually examined his thoughts, and he always prayed to be good. And so he was about as good an example of what you ought to be as a person as you could expect, even from the Puritans. So he was a good example for people. And at the same time, he wasn't all arrogant about it. He felt that he was one of the worst sinners there were. And so everybody could relate to him on that level. He wasn't alienating people by being holier than everybody else and making them just feel more unworthy, because he obviously felt so unworthy himself. He's not bad. There's nobody who knows Puritanism better than Jonathan Edwards. So as far as the theology is concerned, he's a perfect choice. He's also extremely bright. When he's, I think it's 11 or 12 years old, he writes a treatise, a scientific treatise on the wood spider that he has published. He finishes Harvard at, I think it's 16. Now that wasn't as startling as it is now, but it was still pretty impressive. This is obviously a very bright guy who can stand up to the congregations around Boston and the Boston Puritans, the Brahmins, and hold his own intellectually with them. So he's a good choice in that respect. He's not bad in small groups. The problem with him was that he preached in that monotone voice. And the Harvard people said, okay, he passed it on to Edwards, but that's all right. A couple weeks of that kind of preaching, everybody will be fed up with it. They'll want to be entertained again. They'll fire him, and they'll hire one of Stoddard's other followers, or we can get one of our guys in. And the people who had been Stoddard's followers and who were his kind of preacher thought the same thing. Edwards will flop, and then one of us will get the call. What they didn't count on was that Edwards would apply his intellect so impressively in the construction of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That sermon was so powerful that well into the 20th century, it was a model in most Protestant seminaries for how to construct a sermon. You notice that some of the times, Edwards looks like a romantic. He sees the world in symbolic terms. When you look at shadows and images of divine things, one of the things that you see there is that everywhere he looks, he sees not the thing itself, but some symbolic representation of things. A rationalist looks at hills and mountains, he sees topography. He sees places that can be settled and places that can't. He sees rivers, he sees navigation, he sees valleys where things can be grown. He sees how you can lay out the paths. Probably he sees trees and lumber and how you can cut them down and where you can float them down the river and how you can make a buck out of it. Instead, Franklin sees hills and mountains are a type of heaven. They are with difficulty ascended. To ascend them, one must go against the natural tendency of the flesh. This must be contradicted in all the ascent, in every step of it. It's a great deal easier descending into the valleys. So when he looks at it, he sees a moral landscape. He sees that you have to struggle and go against the natural tendency if you want to get to heaven, to go up the mountain. The mountain goes towards heaven. Everybody else takes the low road. Everybody takes the easy path, and they do the wrong thing. So again, when he looks at it, he sees things that are symbolic. If he sees a river, it turns out to be Christianity to him, and it's got all of its branches. When he looks at a tree, he sees the same thing. It's all really in that beauty of the world. The beauty of the world consists wholly of sweet mutual consents, either within itself or with the Supreme Being. As to the corporeal world, though there are many other sorts of consents, yet the sweetest and most charming beauty is its resemblance of spiritual beauties. In other words, Things in the physical world represent things in the supernatural world. And the beauty of this world reflects the beauty of the other world. Rationalist looks at a tree. He sees a certain number of board feet. He sees the price of lumber. Edwards looks at a tree, and again he sees the church, and the branches are the congregations, and the leaves are the parishioners. He looks at a rose, and he doesn't just see something beautiful. He sees the fact that there are thorns on it, and then in order to get to the rose, you have to risk the thorns, and that life is full of these difficulties. Roses grow upon briars, which is to signify that all temporal sweets are mixed with the bitter. Nothing in this world is perfect. It always has its side effects. It always has its problems. And that's why we have the rose. The rose isn't just there because it's beautiful or because it grows in a certain place. It's because it's a message from God. Everything's a message from God. And if you just read Shadows and Images of Divine Things, you would think that Edwards was a happy guy. It's only when you get the sinners in the hands of an angry God that he looks so frightening and so frightened. And so angry himself. When he gets the sinners in the hands of an angry God, it's almost a kind of a parallel to Anne Bradstreet, where she's metaphysical most of the time, and then you get to the prologue and she's writing neoclassical. But when you get the sinners in the hands of an angry God, which is his sermon, there he's a rationalist. The first thing that tells you he's a rationalist is, when you first look at that without even reading it, the first page, what do you notice? Well, maybe they don't jump out at you that much. The numbers, he numbers every point. That's rationalism, step by step, numbering everything. Romantics, remember, are supposed to follow their heart. You really shouldn't even have a plan. When we get to Emerson, you'll see Emerson write essays that ramble around and eventually touch on the 5 or 6 main points he wanted to get to. But if you had to outline an Emerson essay, it would take 8 sheets of paper. When you have anything from Franklin or anything from Edwards, go step by step right down the line. Not only are the things numbered, but he uses a very sophisticated kind of reasoning partway through. First, he starts giving all the reasons why God is going to get the wicked. And he gives 4 of them. And then you notice he starts renumbering. Starts over with number 1 again. In classical logic, logic is arranged in a 3-part argument called a syllogism. It's got a major premise, a minor premise, and if you accept those 2 generalizations, the conclusion is inescapable. One form of the syllogism is either A or B. Not A, therefore B. Or not B, therefore A. So in other words, Frank, he sets up this kind of logic. Instead of arguing his own points, he argues that the points of his opponent are right. Basically, it goes this way. Either I'm right or they're right. And they're wrong. Therefore, I'm right. And when he gets down to the number 1s, he's saying, well, they say that God can't cast men, can't destroy the wicked, because he doesn't seem to be doing so. He says God's all-powerful. Of course he has the ability to punish the wicked. And they say, well, the wicked seem to be doing awfully well. And Edwards says that's because God is lifting them up so they have further to fall. They don't stand on their own. God holds them up, and as soon as he withdraws his hand, they fall towards their destruction. So he takes their argument and he demolishes it. You notice that you have a lot of graphic descriptions with a fairly large number of adjectives of sensation. That's normally a characteristic of the Romantics, because those intense visual, verbal pictures stir up people's emotions. If Edwards is himself terrified of each of these things that he mentions, and he's speaking out of his own fear when he delivers this, is he a rationalist or a romantic? He's a romantic because he's drawing on his own emotions. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case because, first of all, the wide number of fears that he mentions, and secondly, the variety of them, and the fact that there's only one of them that he really repeats more than once. If Edwards really had all 25 or so fears that he mentions, he'd never gotten out of his house. Instead, he's using emotion he's using fear the way that Franklin used humor. He's using it as a tool to get people where he wants them to go. Now, the one fear that he does mention over and over and over again is fire. And you remember, what's the theological significance of fire for the Puritans? Hellfire and damnation. It comes back a lot of times, and it's the only one really that does. They would flame out. If sin were not restrained, it would immediately turn the soul into a fiery oven or a place of fire and brimstone. Yea, doubtless with many that are now in this congregation who had made be at ease, and he is with many of those who are now in the flames of hell. Or the wrath of God burns against them. The pit is prepared, the fire is made ready, the furnace is now hot, ready to receive them. The flames do rage and glow. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. The pit of hell. They have reserved the fiery pit of hell. The devil is waiting for them. Hell is gaping for them. The flames gather and flash about them, and would fain lay hold on them and swallow them up. The fire pent up in their own hearts is struggling to break out. Or the world of misery, the lake of burning brimstone is extended abroad under you. There is a dreadful pit of growing flames of the wrath of God. The Lord will come with fire, his rebuke with flames of fire. So we get about 8 or 10 mentions of fire in it. It does have the terror of theology behind it. But it's also frightening in a practical sense to the Puritans. Why does fire and the mention of fire worry them more than it worries us? How are their lives different? First of all, there's fire everywhere you look. They light their world with fire, they heat their world with fire, they cook with fire. They have open fireplaces, they have open candles, they have no fire-resistant materials. Their houses generally are made out of wood. Their clothes, flax, cotton, goes up like cellophane. They cook in that kettle that swings in and out. You swing that out too fast and it tips over and flaming grease goes across the wooden floor. There's no fire companies. There are no fire alarms. There are no smoke detectors. The houses are usually 3 stories high. You have a room in the attic and you smell smoke, you might as well start praying because you're probably not getting out of there alive. There's no fire escapes. There's no way to put the fire out. Fire is frightening enough for us when we have so many controls and things that resist it. But for them, it's everywhere and it can spread all the time. So when he talks about fire in this sermon, there have to be people in the congregation wondering, did we completely put out the fire in the fireplace before we left? Or is there an ember in there that's going to pop out and we'll go home to a burned down house? Or worse yet, when the fire burns low tonight and we're all asleep, will the fire pop out? Because over and over, Edwards keeps telling him this one simple thing. God can kill you at any moment. Here's a whole list of ways. But he didn't kill you. He let you come here today to get one last chance to turn yourself around. And if you don't, he's going to get you after this. This is your last chance to do anything. So he goes fear by fear. Now some of the fears don't seem that frightening to us. The very first ones he starts out with, falling down. They, that is the wicked, are always exposed to destruction. As one that stands or walks in slippery places is exposed to fall. Or he that walks on slippery ground needs nothing but his own weight to throw him down. Or, he that stands on slippery declining ground, on the edge of a pit, he cannot stand alone. When he is let go, immediately falls and is lost. Why is falling down frightening to them? It isn't as much all of the times of the year. But, you remember the ice yesterday? Multiply that by 100. That's what you get in New England. Ice storms all the time. People coming fairly long walks to church over the ice-strewn, covered ground. And there's no stake out there putting sand or salt on it. There's nobody chipping the ice away. The ice is there, and it's going to be there. It was there on their walk in, and it's going to be there on their walk home. The only difference is God was holding them up on their walk in. We think, okay, you slip on the ice, you fall down, you break your leg, so what? Broken leg can kill you in those days. Any fracture that's bad enough to come through the skin, right away you got a huge hole in you. And you remember how that little hole from the pin was enough to give you a lockjaw. A big hole is even more likely to give you lockjaw. Not to mention the fact you may get gangrene. If the bone is broken through, there's no x-rays. They set the bone by having people hold on to you and somebody pulling the leg out so that your muscles acted like rubber bands and then let it go, hoping it would snap back together in the right place. What's the odds on that happening? The shock alone is likely to kill you. And even if they didn't pull it out, they clamped it with 2 boards and then just wrapped some cloth around it as a splint. The odds are you're going to end up with a crooked leg. So what? A farmer with one short leg is going to have a hard time getting into harvest. And so his life is going to be a struggle from then on. He'll be lucky if he and his family survive, even if he does manage to get through the break. You fall down and hit your head, they might as well shoot you while you're there like a horse. There's nothing they can do for any kind of head injury. And there are all of the... Now, when he preaches that in the summer, this part of the sermon isn't that terrifying. But when he preaches it in the middle of the winter, when they came there and it wasn't icy out, and the sleet starts to build up on the window, and they can hear it hitting the side of the church, and Edwards is telling him, that's what God intends you to fall on the way home if you don't come up to the front and rededicate yourself to living a better life. And I'm sure there had to be some time when somebody managed to get through the sermon without being too terrified, started to walk home, went to the top step, almost slipped and came back in going, Reverend Edwards, is it too late? Can I change my mind? And what you'll notice is that he has a lot of these things that fit in perfectly with a season of the year. For example, they are like great heaps of light chaff before the whirlwind, or large quantities of dry stubble before devouring flames. Wildfire. If you've ever seen a grass fire, it moves with amazing speed. And they were terrified. I mean, now we have, I think it was 149,000 major forest fires a year. They burn up something like 11 million acres of land. And that's with all of the firefighting equipment that we have. Planes flying in and dropping stuff on it, scooping up water and chemicals and all these firefighters, and we still can't put them out. Imagine what a wildfire turns into a forest fire meant to them. It meant complete devastation. Then there's no way out of it. You can't turn on the radio and get advice to go north, because if you go south, the fire is curving around and crossing the parkway. You don't know until you've got your horse galloping down the road that the fire is now leaped in front of you. You don't know what direction to go in. When they came out, and imagine now he preaches this in the middle of the summer, when it hasn't rained for 3 weeks, and everything is dry as tinder. When they walked out of that church, they saw smoke on the horizon. First thing they did, God, don't let it be blown this way, or don't let it be blown towards my farm. Once the fire got started, it was almost impossible to put it out. And I wouldn't be surprised in the least if Jonathan Edwards didn't have, on that hot summer day when the windows were open, one of his deacons sitting outside the window with a little knot of grass, lighting the end up and letting the smoke waft in through the window. If he really is a rationalist, would he have felt guilty about that? Not in the least. I had to do a little showmanship in order to save their souls. That's not a problem. There's nothing immoral in that. My job is to make people see what a terrifying situation they're in, and anything I need to do in order to do that, short of outright lying, is perfectly okay. Other things that don't seem too scary to us. Unconverted men walked over the pit of hell on a rotten covering, and there are innumerable places in this covering so weak that they will not bear their weight, and these places are not seen. Now what they're talking about there is the wells are hand dug, and they go dry. When they go dry, do they fill them back in? No, that dirt is long gone. These were guys who would work hard all the time. They didn't have a spare 3 or 4 days to fill in a well. Plus, according to Professor Callender, the wells go down sometimes 80 feet. And an 80-foot column, 3 feet, even 3 feet in diameter, is an awful lot of cubic feet of dirt. So instead, they just took boards and put them down over the opening to the well. But of course, after a while, the weeds grow up over them, and the boards get rot, and you can't see them. And some of those wells were dug out in the field so they could get water immediately to their cattle without having to bring them back in. And those dried up. And so they put the boards over them. Now, some people lived in the town and walked on the streets, but a great many lived outside of town. Some walked on the roads, and some came across the field. And probably everybody in that congregation had at some time or another stepped on one of those planks and felt it either crack or vibrate under their foot, thought, boy, one more step and I'd have been a goner. Well, it's not an 80-foot drop. If you've ever been to New England, even as far as New York, there's a stone wall every 20 feet because they got so many rocks. The idea that you can dig straight down probably is nowhere in New York that could happen. So as you dig down, you hit a rock. Well, you just move over a little bit and dig around it. And then you hit another one and you dig around that. So the fall is really like maybe 20 feet, you hit a rock, you slide, you drop 20 more, you slide, you drop 10, you drop 10, you drop 20, pretty soon you're at the bottom of the well. You break a leg, you're done anyway. But maybe you bounce all the way down there, you got a lot of bruises, you got a lot of scrapes, but otherwise you're unharmed. What's the problem? Who's going to find you? Because they don't have time to come looking. And in fact, you go to town on Monday. You're not late in town until Wednesday. They're not sending anybody to find out what happened to you until Friday. You went on Monday, you're not expected home until Wednesday, so people at home aren't really worried until Friday, at which time they got to send somebody to town. So it could be more than a week before anybody figures out you never got there. And then how are they going to find you? There are all those fields and all those wells. Remember, you can't see those wells. Once you stepped on that board and it broke, you go through, the hole isn't that big, and the weeds come back up again. And the only way you can find that hole is to almost fall in it yourself. And there's no National Guard around you could get to join hands and walk across the field. I mean, even when a child disappeared, they didn't have the manpower or the time to organize everybody and walk hand in hand across every field there was. So if you end up at the bottom of that well, the chances are you're going to die of exposure, if not from your wounds. And people just aren't going to find you. And this, of course, you can imagine how much terror this strikes in the hearts of mommies. I mean, they're worried about this all the time. You got a 10-year-old and you say to him, don't go in the fields, there are hidden wells there. Where's the first place he goes? And a 10-year-old boy finds a plank that bounces up and down, he's going to jump on it. So that meant any time your kid was 5 minutes late for supper, you're thinking, oh, it's in the well. But where? Where is it? Half an hour late, an hour late. It's a wonder they didn't all commit suicide early on. I mean, it's just these terrors all around them. And here's Jonathan Edwards saying, look, you walked in, there were all of these wells waiting for you to fall into them with the rickety boards. And God guided you around them. But He's not guiding you on the way home. Those same wells are still there waiting for you. How about this one? Like greedy, hungry lions that see their prey and expect to have it, but are for the present kept back. Lions in America? Not African lions, but the mountain lion and the black panther, both indigenous to New England, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And not only the lions, of course, tigers and bears, oh my. Bears, wolves, bobcats, lots of things with teeth out there. And they didn't eat you on the way in because God wanted you to get in and hear this sermon. That doesn't mean they're not going to eat you on the way back out again. For that. Oh, even the storms frightened to them. There are black clouds of God's wrath now hanging directly over your heads, full of dreadful storm and big with thunder. And were it not for the restraining hand of God, it would immediately burst forth upon you. Why is thunder and lightning so frightening to them? Well, it's not too frightening to us because we're in our cars or we're in our houses. And we have lightning rods. About 1,000 people a year get struck by lightning anyway. Which, by the way, makes the odds on... if you got struck by lightning 11 times in a row, it would be the same odds as winning the lottery. And a lot more people got struck by lightning then. Why? More people were out in the rain. We know what the weather's going to be. Well, okay, we don't know what the weather's going to be. I mean, they hyped this with the storm of the century. Because it was likely? No, because it was a worst-case scenario and it would attract the most viewers. 5 years ago, weathermen wouldn't have done that. They said there's a 25% chance you get 2 inches, there's a 30% chance you get 4. They were saying the woolly mammoth is coming back, it's the next ice age, everybody get food, we're all going to be snowed in for 6 months. But other than when they're trying to get ratings, we know what the weather's going to be a week in advance. They had no idea when they left the house what it was going to be. You know how often the weather changes here. I mean, that's the joke on Jersey. Don't like the weather? Stick around half an hour. And the weather in New England is just as changeable. And so it might look like a sunny day, but you had to go for a walk. It was going to take you 3 or 4 hours each way. You couldn't be certain you weren't going to end up in the middle of a thunderstorm on the way back. And those, if you've ever been out in a thunderstorm in the woods, it gets pretty scary. I mean, the trees are blowing around and things are falling down and lightning's lighting everything up, and it looks like it's going to strike you at any moment. And there, it was as bad for the people out in the storm as it was for people at home, because they don't know. You went to town. Did you stay there because you thought a storm was coming in, and that's why you're not back? Or are you trying to make your way home and you're caught in the storm? You can see how much more worried there, like there isn't enough to go around now. How much more worry there was for them, for everybody in the family, whenever they were out. Plus, people got struck a lot because now when people get struck by lightning, it's usually at some sporting event. We have a big open space and you have people standing up. Well, they're lightning rods. In those days, of course, the farmers are out in the field. These are guys with more work than they can get done. And they can't afford to unhitch the horse from the plow because there's some thunder off in the distance or there's some lightning way over there. They wait until it gets close before they even think about leaving the field. And then they've got to unhitch the horse and slap it so it runs to the barn. And then they've got to start that long 200 or more yard run across open ground themselves, with their wives standing on the porch saying, "That poor fat old man, I am a widow. He's not going to make it, and if he does, his heart will burst by the time he gets here." Anytime anybody was out, and they got struck. And of course, remember, their houses got struck, and then you've got fire. So when he talks about God's wrath, and they believe in people getting struck by lightning as part of God's wrath, sinners are more likely to get struck by lightning. Now, when he preached this sermon, considering how many times he did it, there had to be a number of times when he got to that point in the sermon, there was a clap of thunder outside. You can bet that there was a stampede of people towards the front of the church by the time that sermon was over, all rededicating themselves to becoming real members of the elect. And again, it plays to the weather. You notice how no matter what the weather is out, there's some part of that sermon that's going to bring the dangers of that weather home to you. And of course, along with the thunder goes the threat of flood. The wrath of God is like great waters that are dammed for the present. They increase more and more and rise higher and higher till an outlet is given. And the longer the stream is stopped, the more rapid and mighty is its course when once it let loose. The waters are constantly rising. If God should only withdraw his hand from the floodgate, it would immediately fly open, and the fiery floods of fierceness and wrath of God would rush forth with inconceivable power, fury, and come upon you with omnipotent power. We're still getting flooded. Why do people still get caught in floods? Because we keep building in the floodplain. We never seem to learn. And if we build in the floodplain with water systems, where did they build their houses? Generally, as close to a stream as they could get. A stream, you don't have to worry about a river overflowing. The stream will be enough. There are no wild rivers left in America. There are stretches of river that are wild. But every river system in America has got dams on it that control the flow of water. And we still have floods. Well, they had none. They had a few earthen dams. But earthen dams, if you've got any rain for a long period of time, they become almost useless because they get soaked and they liquefy at the bottom. And that sucks the water in behind them and they just wash out completely. There was one in California about 10 or 15 years ago that washed out and drowned I think it was an elementary school. And these are dams that we've made with big earth-moving equipment that have been pounded down. I mean, there are dams where guys with shovels shoveling the dirt in and hitting it with the back of the shovel to make it taut. All those dams did was build up an even bigger head of water. There were beaver dams, and beaver dams do hold back the water, but not for all that long. Once the water gets to a certain length, it just washes away, and then you have a big flood coming down. And we know when it's coming. We know when the flood stage is going to pass each part on the river. We know it at 12, 15 hours in advance. They had no idea. Sometimes their only clue to the flood was sitting on the front porch saying, "Look at that fog rolling in, Ma. Oh my God, that's a wall of water." And then where do you go? Well, maybe you get up on the roof, and maybe you get the family up on the roof, but there's nobody in helicopters coming looking for you when you're up there. There's nobody in rowboats. There's no government agency. All your immediate neighbors are in as bad a shape as you are, more than likely, and anybody more distant doesn't even know you're in trouble. They haven't even heard about the flood where you are. So nobody's coming to help you. So maybe you last out a couple days, and maybe it's not that big a flood and the water goes down. Are you okay then? All the crops are gone. All the stuff you had in the barn is gone. They stored their vegetables and things in root cellars. Was it more than 3 feet down where the temperature doesn't change and remains constant? Put stuff in there. Even a minor flood rots all of that. And if that flood occurs towards the end of the summer, you're not getting another crop in. You've got nothing between you and starvation all winter. Except maybe the nuts and berries you can gather. And sure, the Puritans helped one another out, but everybody in the congregation is probably in as bad a shape as you're in. So when he talks about the floods, even survival, you got the family on the roof, you certainly didn't get the cow up there. So the cow's probably gone, so's the horse. How are you going to plow the field now? So even surviving the immediate flood didn't mean you weren't going to die long range. And when he mentions those floods, everybody's worried about them because most of them live right next to the water. And they never know when it's going. And probably some of them had made their way there across swollen streams, wading across. Because Edwards tells them God wanted you to get here. That's why he let you through the stream this time. But you may not get back through those streams alive. Or maybe God will let you get back to the house so you can get to sleep. And then the flood waters will come rushing in. And you won't know they're there until you notice how wet the bedclothes are. And then you stand up and realize you're up to your chest in water. And where's everybody else in the house? And imagine when he preached this, when it had been raining for 6 days straight. And it was raining hard. Even if there wasn't any thunder, everybody's thinking about that water that's upstream, that's coming down later. That God has kept away from you to give you this one last chance to change your life. And you better do it, because this is the only chance you're going to get. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the bow at your heart, and strains the bow, and is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. What are they afraid of there? Bows and arrows? Indian attack. There hadn't been any Indian attacks for a long time. It doesn't matter. Reality is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is what people believe is real. If you believe the Indians could attack at any moment, if that's what you used to scare your children with, if that's what your grandparents used to scare you with, then it's going to be real for you. And when he talks about that, but they're snipers. You can't see them. The bow is aimed at, the arrow is aimed at you, and the bow is drawn, and you don't know. You won't know until the arrow hits you. So you're walking home now and you hear a crack of twigs in the woods, which you didn't even think about on the way in, and somebody's thinking, oh, it's the lions come to eat us, and somebody else is thinking, no, it's the Indians come to kill us. And again, God kept that bow from being let go on the way in. He's not going to be letting it go on the way out. God holds you over the pit of hell much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. Spiders are scary for a lot of people. Arachnophobia. Okay, it lost it at the end, but it was a pretty good movie up to that point. But some people, no matter what size spider you get, they're scared of them. They have legitimate reason to be scared. Now an adult in good health gets bitten by a spider, even a black widow, you won't die from it. There's only one spider that will definitely kill you. It's a little red spider that grows on bananas in South America. And its toxin acts on the nerves. That's why it kills you. But if you're run down, if you're old, or if you're very young, a black widow spider bite can kill you. Not only the black widow, the brown recluse. Now, the brown recluse injects venom, and its venom causes the tissue to necrose. It dies. And you end up with a hole about the size of a dime. You could actually probably push a dime down into. Now, you get antibiotics, you get to have a scar. That's about the only. But in those days, you have a hole that big in you, you're almost a certainty for tetanus. Plus, the infection itself can kill you. And the spiders are everywhere. Remember, they live with houses in the middle of woods. They heat their houses with wood. You go out to the wood pile and pick up the wood, probably you're disturbing a spider web, which for the spider is a three-way major highway project. I mean, it takes a long time for it to get that. It's an angry spider. And not only can you get bitten and killed picking up the wood, but you can carry that death inside to your children and your family. Now, because God protected you before, but nothing's going to keep you from spiders now. And there had to be a time when he preached this. Went down from the ceiling. Yeah, maybe it was only a daddy long-legger, but everybody looked at him, it's the spider of death. Or one crawled along the baseboard, or was running on the floor, and everybody saw it and thought, oh my God, this is the spiders coming to bite us. Because God hates us like spiders. God's got spiders everywhere that can kill us. You know, it's how trivial it is. I mean, you can't get away from spiders. There's probably a spider somewhere in this room. That's going to terrify people if they're afraid of spiders. And there certainly was in almost every room in their day. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful venomous serpent is in ours. What kind of venomous serpents did they have? They had a rattlesnake, they had a copperhead, and I've had two differing opinions on this. One student told me that the water moccasin is only a southern snake. And another one said, no, it goes up into Pennsylvania and into New England as well. But you at least got the copperhead and the rattlesnake. Now, we don't see snakes that much. We've destroyed most of their habitat. But think where they live. They're coming across fields, climbing over these stone fences. Well, stone fence is a snake condo. They love that because they can crawl up on it and sun themselves and then crawl back into crevices. And you kick the stone loose climbing over, and you've got an angry snake right there at your ankle. And and God kept you from kicking the stones loose on the way in, He's not going to stop you from kicking them loose on the way out. And there's thousands of snakes out there. And even the people who went on the road didn't have to climb over the walls. They go home in summer. It wasn't uncommon to see a snake. And on the dirt road, you could see where the snake had been, even if it wasn't there. And now you think this is the snake that God sent, God has sent, because Jonathan Edwards told you so, to come and bite you. Even the most common thing can kill you. He talks about being trampled on, that God will step on you. And even though He knows that you can't bear His weight, He'll trample on you until the blood soaks all of His raiment, all of His clothes. Well, what were they afraid of getting trampled by? One, cattle. You don't have the big herds of cattle and the stampedes. That's the 1880s. But they have little narrow streets, maybe not even half as wide as this room. 4 cows running down that street is a stampede. They can trample you pretty easily. Horses being spooked and running away can trample you. You send your 10-year-old out to bring the cows in because it's going to rain, and as soon as he opens the gate, there's a crack of thunder, and the cows knock the fence open and run over him. You go to saddle a horse. Some horses don't like you in the stall with them. They'll step on you. You go to milk the cow. Now cows, nobody's really afraid very much of cows. And they got those big brown eyes and they look so nice. But they're about the dumbest animal ever made. And they'll step, if a cow steps on your foot and leaves his foot there, it's like somebody parked a Volkswagen on it. And there you are in the middle of all this cow dung and horse dung with a shoe full of blood and bone. You're almost certain to get an infection and die. And it can get you anywhere. God is out there. Now, the last thing that He says, after He's laid out all of these ways God can kill you and will kill you if you don't change your life, He says at the end, fly out of Sodom. And it's kind of like He gets to the end and it's, for the next 15-minute Kmart shoppers, blue light special, salvation in aisle 9. But it's only the next 15 minutes. If you don't go up to the front of that church and rededicate yourself to being a good Puritan, and you walk out that door, God is going to see you dead within an hour, as far as Jonathan Edwards is concerned.
What if they did go up there and it happened anyway? What did he say?
I don't know. I guess they would have said, well, they were only pretending. They didn't really mean it when they went up to the front. And so God knew that, because you can't lie to God, so God got them on the way home. In order for all those other people who only went up and gave it lip service, so they would know He's coming for them next, and they'll really change their lives. That's probably what He would have done with it. Now you notice again, He's got a fear for every weather. He's got a fear for every season. If He doesn't get you with the spiders, He'll get you with the snakes. If He doesn't get you with the snakes, He'll get you with falling in dark places. It's almost like He took... Stephen King once wrote an article about writing horror stories, and he listed 15 basic fears. And it's like Jonathan Edwards sat down and said, now what are all the things people can be afraid of? Made a long list, spread them out, wrote the sermon to encompass all those fears. If he did, is he a romantic or a rationalist? He's a rationalist. He's using it to manipulate other people. The end justifies the means. And again, he's doing what Franklin did with humor. He's using people's emotions in order to get them to do the right thing. But he's manipulating them. He's not convincing them. He does have an argument all through the sermon, which will convince you intellectually. But most of his conversions didn't come from intellectual conversion. It came from emotion. When he preached this sermon, sometimes he had to stop because the sobbing in the congregation, people believing they were damned and they were not going to live out the hour, was so loud that he couldn't be heard. When he preached, he traveled up and down the eastern seaboard delivering his sermon, and at times when he did, there were riots. People ran screaming from the church, started fires, started breaking things up, because either they thought the world was going to end at any moment, and maybe if they got busy first on the destruction, God would think they were on His side and He would cut them a little slack. Or they were so terrified they didn't know what they were doing, or they were so angry that they were going to be destroyed at any moment that they wanted to get some of their own back before it started. But whatever the reason, that sermon caused riots. It terrified people. And it wasn't because he was such a great actor. It was because the words are so carefully constructed. Just exactly the way. Remember with the playing style? You give people concrete examples. Everything he has got a concrete example that has to do with the structure. Anybody have any questions or comments on Edwards? Okay, let's take a break till 8:35 then, and then we're going to do the Fireside Poets, and then we'll do